On this episode of Church in Maine, we take a look at an old sermon and its insights into how the church can diffuse the toxic anger that's infecting American society. That's coming up. Hello and welcome to Church in Maine, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host, and welcome back to your fall. If there is one word that could describe our current politics right now, it would be anger. I think you see it everywhere. You see it on our podcasts, you see it on social media, you definitely see it on the news, and yes, you see it in Washington. The anger in our politics doesn't move us anywhere forward towards solutions. All it does is that it forces us to dig in, to draw lines. And that anger really kind of infects everything in our lives. It infects our relationships. It infects our entertainment. And it also infects our churches. So how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this anger, especially as Christians? And how do we love each other regardless of our politics? Recently, I happened to listen to a sermon from 2022 based on Luke 9:51-56, and it was by a pastor, an Episcopal priest, Aaron Zimmerman. He is the Rector of St. Albans Episcopal Church in Waco, Texas. I thought it was a great sermon. This is a passage where Jesus and the disciples are rejected by a Samaritan village. And two of his disciples are very angry. And they want to take out some revenge, and Jesus rebukes them. It was a great sermon tailored to those times. But I wondered, since it was from 2022, I wanted to know, did it still ring true today? Because especially in the times that we live in, what made sense in 2022, I don't know, does it make sense in 2025? So I invited Aaron to come on to the podcast. And so a little bit more about who Aaron is. He is, as I said, the Rector of St. Albans in Waco. He's also the co-host of the lectionary podcast, Same Old Song with Jacob Smith. Jacob was also on this podcast earlier this year. So I've had both of them on now. Before coming to St. Albans, Aaron served in churches in Pittsburgh and in Houston. He is also a contributor to the Mockingbird blog and magazine. He has also served on as president of Mockingbird's board of directors. So, with all of that, please listen in to this really, I think, important conversation that I had with Aaron Zimmerman. Well, Aaron, thanks for being able to chat with me this afternoon. I wanted to start off just to get a little bit to know about you, your spiritual journey, where'd you grow up, and then kind of go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I was born to a Catholic mother and a Protestant father, and so I was raised in the Episcopal Church. That seemed to fit. But yeah, and so we moved around a lot, but whenever we were in a place long enough to go to church, we always went to an Episcopal church, but it wasn't that frequent. I'm one of those kids that caught the Jesus bug in high school, and through a really good youth ministry at the church where I was at the time in North Carolina. Shout out to St. Paul's in Winston-Salem. And then by the time I finished college, the idea of ministry was still kind of rattling around in there. And so I took some time to think and pray and do some ministry work overseas and in the U.S. and really really became very clear on the idea that this is something that I wanted to do, and eventually went to seminary. And I think just something about my background. When I got to seminary, I thought that I was there to learn how to use theology and scripture to motivate people, inspire people, scare people, berate people, somehow get them to make themselves better through trying harder, because I was up there in the pulpit cheering them on or lecturing them or something. But that was my job, and that's what I went to seminary to do. And I realized through some really important people when I was in seminary that actually the headline is Jesus Christ is the friend of sinners, as the New Testament says, or that God loves human beings. And so that was a real big paradigm shift for me, something I knew intellectually but didn't really I don't know, hadn't really applied it in how I thought about ministry. And so, but that's been the focus of my ministry for, 15 years or so. I was ordained in 2008. My math is probably wrong, but I'm a preacher, not a mathematician. And I've served churches in Houston, in Pittsburgh, and been in Waco for the last 12 years, where I'm the rector of St. Albans Episcopal Church.
Okay.
Is that what you want, or you want more of a prayer life?
Nope,
what are you looking for? Okay.
Nope, that is
How many
exactly
times I
what
walk the labyrinth, or I don't know. Okay.
No, that is okay. You can tell me, but you don't need to.
Yeah, let's move on.
So, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast was to talk to you a little bit about a sermon that you gave back in 2022 at St. Albans, and it was about the story is basically about Jesus and a Samaritan village. Mm-hmm. And they're kind of going past this village, and they're looking for a place to stay, and basically the village doesn't want them. And James and John, as I think you said, wanted God to call down an airstrike on them.
That's right. Send in the drones.
Yeah. Yep. And Jesus said no.
And
that became actually kind of an interesting take on the political situation, especially in 2022. Those were, especially we were going into midterms and all of that. And now, of course, 3 years later, it's a whole cycle of the lectionary cycle later.
Yeah.
And so one of the reasons I wanted to bring you back is to talk about, does that, what you were talking about in that sermon, still make sense today? But before we get to that question, kind of talk about maybe preaching about or talking about what you were trying to get at that time in history, which seems like 100 years ago.
Yeah, 30 years ago, 2022. Yeah, fresh out of the pandemic, all of that. I think, that passage from Luke 9, what I was trying to get at was the fact that the anger that James and John displayed at the Samaritans, which obviously that, we tend to think of the first century, and especially when we read about Jesus and the disciples, everything has this hazy spiritual vibe to it. But the dispute between the Jewish residents of that part of the world and the Samaritan residents of that part of the world, it was a religious, but it was also a political fight. And it was also a political fight between two parties that were both being oppressed by a big Roman Empire. So there were political dimensions to all of it. And what struck me about it was the anger and the righteousness that I saw from James and John, these two disciples of Jesus, and the people on the opposing side, the wrong side, the Samaritans, in their rejection of Jesus. This triggered for James and John a desire for retribution, a desire to eliminate the enemy, and this really impulsive, I must crush you sort of energy. And by the way, they also think that Jesus is on a political mission, because Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, which would be the kind of center of the power, obviously, in that region. And they think he's going to kick out the Romans and reestablish his throne as a political and military ruler. And so they're just getting a foretaste of that. And they want, maybe an early win on the battlefield to begin to, get Jesus' name more out there and get people really trembling when he goes to Jerusalem. So I think, what I was trying to do was to address the fact that there are political realities in the scriptures. I don't tend to preach politically driven sermons.
Mm.
But I did see those elements in the passage, and I was feeling those currents in the community, in the country, like all these. We are just at a really divisive time, as you know, and all your listeners know. And so, what I was trying to do there is also get into the personal, the individual. I think a lot of sermons that do kind of tiptoe or maybe jump right into the political waters tend to make it about big issues out there. And I think a lot of it really starts in the human heart. And Jesus' teaching gets at this all the time when he says about don't look at the log in your brother or sister's eye, look at the plank in your own, or don't look at the speck in your brother or sister's eye, look at the log in your own eye. So, as Michael Jackson said, if you want to make the change, you got to look at yourself, right? Start with the man or woman in the mirror. So I wanted to get kind of personal and look at James and John, like where is this coming from for them? Where does this come from for us? And and to look at this issue of anger. That's one of the things I really wanted to get at, which I think is, again, it's a reality at all times in politics, but certainly one we see around now and can be pretty toxic.
Do you think, especially in our current time when we are, well, let me rephrase that. Why are we not so good at looking at ourselves, looking at the log in our own eye? I mean, we are really good at pointing out everything that is wrong with them. We are terrible of actually focusing and saying, where have I messed up? Where have I fallen short?
I think that is probably a pretty standard human default setting, is to be much more aware of what other people are doing and judging and critiquing that. And it is uncomfortable to look at ourselves. Who likes to see the truth about themselves? Denial and numbing ourselves is much more comfortable. And I think the anger in our political cycles and our anger and our rhetoric is another one of those things that can be numbing. And just self-righteousness is it's a hell of a drug. Like, it's really addictive. It makes you feel good about yourself. It makes you feel morally superior to other people. And so I think if you can, and having an enemy makes one feel powerful. And there's nobody out there, I think, that's really telling you to not do those things. I mean, when I go to my gym, I can see like 15 different TV screens above the treadmills, and they have the Fox News, the CNN, the MSNBC, whatever, and everybody's trying to make some group of people angry and paint some other folks as an enemy. And so there's never like a PSA that comes on these news channels that's like, by the way, have you looked at your own life? Have you done some examination of your own heart? And maybe you're so angry because there's some stuff that's unresolved from your family of origin. That never happens on any of the networks. And so I think you have to, one of the reasons why people don't do this is, one, it's uncomfortable, and two, there's very few voices that are encouraging any sort of self-reflection. All the money, all the outrage, all the hype, all the need to sell advertising spots and make money on these for-profit networks, but it's not their fault. Like, they're tapping into something that human beings already really, really like, which is, we like to feel angry, we like to feel morally superior, and we like to have enemies, and we like to demonize other people, which is exactly what James and John do. Like, just to say, let's call down fire from heaven on the Samaritans because they rebuked Jesus, you have to do some pretty serious dehumanization to feel like that's an appropriate response to people rejecting Jesus.
Well, in thinking about that, especially about dehumanization, and again, when you did the sermon was in 2022. Mm-hmm. It's 3 years later. I don't know if I can say things have gotten worse, but I don't think they've improved. And so, what are your thoughts about this sermon 3 years later? Does it still make sense? And how, I guess, how do we get ourselves out of this mess?
Right. Yeah. I mean, absolutely, it makes sense. Human beings, sadly, are still the same. I guess my sermon didn't work. So it seems like the tendency for human beings to be angry and to dehumanize and to otherize and basically call out as enemies is still pretty apparent. And I think what's one of the tragic elements of this is that Jesus Christ specifically tells us to love our enemies, and so He does. So, if we're in a political conversation, we feel like some group of people are our enemies. That doesn't get us off the hook either. So we're
Hmm.
supposed to love those people. And yeah, I don't think we've gotten too much better. I think I do see glimmers of hope occasionally. You see people trying to do some bipartisan work. There's all the political chatter can be pretty corrosive and toxic and very black and white kind of thinking, polarized thinking. But in my spare time, I sometimes listen to podcasts where actual politicians, lawmakers, people in government administration talk about things. And you do hear stories about people actually trying to do the job of government, which is encouraging. I think I do feel if anything's changed, maybe it's this. And of course, everything waxes and wanes and ebbs and flows. So we'll probably go through another cycle. But I do feel a certain amount of fatigue. I think the 2024 election was exhausting for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are folks, I mean, I know people that were kind of biting their nails on the edge of their seat, listening to 5 political podcasts a week, and then after the election, how whether they were happy or whether they were upset, they've sort of just checked out. It's hard to maintain that level of being worked up, I guess. So. But yes, I think basically people are still the same, angry. We tend to dehumanize and judge, and that's why I think the call in this passage it still holds true. So I don't know if I would change anything here, but I think I would continue to invite myself and other people to, when we're thinking, and this is, I think, one of the things if I had a mission when I talk about things like this or when I preach about things like this, I want people to ask themselves, kind of, why am I so angry about X, Y, or Z thing? Why does this matter so much to me? Why does, the world is full of injustices and really horrible things that people are doing to each other, governments that are doing awful things. And why do I care specifically about this one so much? Is it because it's the one I've heard the most about? Is it because it allows me to feel superior to somebody who lives down the street from me, who has a flag in their yard that I don't like? I think there's often just a personal psychological dimension that we're not aware of. And so this is not to say like differences of opinion don't matter and you shouldn't have them. And, definitely have thoughts and have opinions and research and stuff. But I often, there's so much, I think, unexamined in one's inner life that drives a lot of the political conversation. And I don't see a lot of people having those conversations out loud or in public very much. I don't know if that gets to your question. Ask me another question. Well, rein me in, Dennis. Rein me in.
Well, I was actually going to ask you, where do you think the church has fallen down on this? Because I'm going to be honest, I think the church has fallen down on this. I don't think we've done a good job of discipling people, of helping people to see that the person on the other side is not necessarily always has horns or something. And there's 30 years ago, when I was kind of involved in things, especially with kind of LGBTQ inclusion, and especially if churches had votes and really difficult votes on this issue, I almost always would hear someone say, well, now we're going to have to work on healing. There was always this sense that this was a group of people that were of different people, but they had to work of ways of how to reknit themselves after this very stressful time. I don't hear that phrase anymore. In fact, I don't think I've heard that phrase anymore for about 10, 15 years. And so that we don't anymore care about that other person that disagrees with us. Right. And I sometimes wonder, where has the church failed in helping to see that other person that we may not agree with is a child of God?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a big believer in that idea that sort of, it's kind of a cliche management phrase, but tone starts at the top. And so I think what church leaders model around this really matters. And I think, I know in my own denomination, which tends to skew left, although it's not exclusively that way, there has been, there can be among some leaders and some voices, a very a self-righteous tone that condemns the other side, the more conservative sisters and brothers, siblings among us, but you also see that on the right. I could name you any number of churches that have called out people on the left and dehumanized them. And I think, so if you get permission, even if it's sort of a subtle winking permission from your leaders, I think that's a problem, and that sort of gives a permission structure to the people in the pews or the stackable chairs to feel entitled to that. I think I think people sadly use scripture like kind of righteous anger, and will pull out passages
or Jesus
to justify
flipping the
that.
Tables.
Right, Jesus, which is not a political thing at all.
No.
It's about making sure people can not be taken advantage of financially, and that all people can actually get into the place, get into the temple and the court of the Gentiles specifically. But so tone starts at the top. So how leaders speak about politics and politicians and people, I think, does positive or negatively can impact how what is normal and what's acceptable. The other thing I think that the church could do a better job at is specifically naming the love of God for all people. And the previous presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Michael Curry, would always say, things like, Jesus loves Republicans, Jesus loves Democrats. Cornel West does a great job of this whenever he's talking about political leaders. He'll say, in the last election, he would say Brother Joe or Brother Donald. Even using that kind of family, personal first name language is, I think, it does a lot. When you say Trump or Biden, like, you're not talking about a person as much. You're not talking about kind of an idea and an office and an image and a brand. So Brother Donald and Brother Joe is very different. It's very humanizing. So I think how you talk about it matters. I think being very specific about naming that we have different opinions on things, different views on things, and that's right and good, as we should in the body of Christ, and that can be seen as not a bug but as a feature. We do that a lot at St. Albans, talking about theological diversity, and that's not something that we need to be threatened by or run from. The main things are the main things. Jesus is the reason for the season, but there's lots of things under that we can and will disagree on. And I tell new members, I tell people we interview for staff, like, if you're looking for a church where everybody agrees on everything, this probably will not be comfortable for you, and good luck finding a church. But if you're at a place where we keep the main thing, but we can and will have healthy conversations about other stuff we disagree about, then you'll be at home here. And so I think just verbalizing that is helpful. I think the church, and this is the last thing I'll say, I think the church I think it could do a better job at understanding Jesus's rejection of politics as a way to fundamentally change human society. He is asked to be king. He specifically chooses not to take that role. I mean, he is the King of Kings, and but even when Pontius Pilate is questioning him, "Are you a king?" he says, "You say that I am." But when a crowd of people of his own group, they love what he's saying, they grab him, they want to parade him on their shoulders into town and make him king, and he slips through them because he has no interest in that. And Jesus seems to be very careful not to fall prey to the temptation of taking the political levers of power. This is one of the temptations that Satan offers Jesus. He says, "Bow down before me and I'll give you political power. You'll be the ruler of all the cities in the world." And I think Christians, whether they're on the left or the right, need to be really careful about how much they desire political power. And it's not to say to don't do it or don't run for office or don't serve on city council, but as I said, do that inner soul work of where am I and why am I approaching this way? Am I seeing people as my fellow image bearers of God? So I think that, like, connecting, I think the church really needs to wrestle with the fact that Jesus doesn't seem to think that political means are the main way to change society. Now, there are times when Christians are called, and I mean, you can name any number of things, whether it's Dr. Martin Luther King and Junior and his work with across the American South for the Civil Rights Movement across the United States, or whether it's looking at William Wilberforce or looking at what Gandhi does. Like, there are people whose religious and spiritual convictions drive them to work in politics. But I think those people, Wilberforce, King, Gandhi, these are all people who are deeply connected to their own humanity, to their faith tradition. These are people who I think are doing that soul work of what's going on in me internally, spiritually, so they can approach it. I think that's why somebody like King can pray for his enemies and can bless those who curse him, and I think that's the root of the power. So anyways, that's, I think the church could do a lot more to talk about that, and to that Jesus wasn't someone who saw controlling, like getting the levers of power as the way to fix the world. And Christians, when they do that, I think get a little like, get my team to be in the throne, and then the world will be fixed. And I think history is full of examples of that not working.
Yeah, I think, Martin Luther King especially had a very strong belief in loving the enemy. And it seems
Yeah.
like that is something that we've forgotten, that was
Yeah.
an important aspect of his work. It wasn't a side benefit. That was central to his work of justice.
Yeah, I think it was the heart of it, and it's the heart of Christ's ministry. I mean, to Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. And I mean, people come at him with all this hate, and he responds with love. And I think that is kind of when Christians have made real change, I think in politics, that's often a part of it. And I think any person who is in politics publicly as a Christian person and uses language that dehumanizes or mocks people and their suffering and their pain, and doesn't display that Christ-like love of enemy, I think they need to go back to Jesus kindergarten and start over, because I think they're sort of missing the main thing. And I think, final, to your question about where the church has gone wrong, I think a lot of times when it talks about politics, I think it misses. I think there's like scripture is just lost. I think there's an assumption of kind of what is right and wrong politically without going back to the text. Like, what does it actually say in the text? What is his relationship with political power in his day? What do the letters of the New Testament say? Like, what do we learn from the Hebrew scriptures? Like, the Israelites want a king, and Samuel tells them this is a really bad idea, and you're going to regret this. So I think there are a lot of things in the scriptures that challenge the way we think politically, and I don't see a lot of preachers talking about that. I see preachers getting up in a pulpit being angry on the left or the right and promoting a cause, and I may actually agree with that cause, but I'm like, would you please, like, if you're going to say something, like, connect it to where you are in the scriptures with this. If you're against how people are being treated, tell me where you're drawing on that. Like, I think we assume a level of theological education and scriptural literacy that is not always there, that I think could be really helpful to people. In Texas, we got this debate about the 10, well, not a debate, it's now state law to put the 10 Commandments in all public schools. And this is a move largely driven by Christians. And I think about Jesus' statements in the Sermon on the Mount, where he quotes the 10 Commandments, he quotes Moses, and he says things like, "You have heard it said, blah, 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 but I say to you," something else, basically saying, I'm trying to move you to a different paradigm. And St. Paul, the letter killeth, but the Spirit gives life. Like, he's saying there's a new dynamic in how we interact with God, and yet Christians are trying to put the 10 Commandments on the walls in schools. And I'm thinking, I mean, if you want to put scripture on the walls, I mean, there's a whole church-state question. But if we're just going to say we're going to throw that out, we're just going to put scripture on the walls, why not put something from the Sermon on the Mount? Why not put love your neighbors yourself? Why not put don't worry about the speck and worry about the plank in your own eye? Like because I think the scriptures are cautious, and especially the New Testament, about the power of the law to change a human heart, a demand, a lecture, a threat to really change somebody's heart. And so, like, from a theological perspective as a Christian, that's where I kind of get off the bus and don't support the idea of the 10 Commandments in schools. It's just my opinion, and you can disagree with me. But that's not because of a church-state constitutional thing. I mean, partly, but mostly it's because of how I understand the law from the Christian perspective in the New Testament. So that when I say, like, teach about Scripture, this is not some, like, left-wing talking point that I just believe because I've listened to a lot of public radio or whatever. It's because of how I read the Scriptures. So it's one thing I think the church has not always done a good job of teaching through the Scriptures and how that should shape our policy. I taught through I teach through a book of the Bible on a Wednesday Bible study, and there's a lot of stuff in Leviticus, and as the Jewish people come into the land and how they're supposed to live, Deuteronomy and Leviticus commandments about how harvest and agriculture should go so that immigrants can eat. Like they're supposed to come and like you're supposed to not be totally efficient in your harvest, leave some food kind of lying around so that other people, migrants especially, and foreigners and poor people can come and get food. And there's just a lot of instructions about that. And I remember telling the class at the time, and this was way before our current immigration debates. This was several years ago, but I said, whatever you think about your policy on immigration, if you as a Christian have not wrestled with these texts, like this is where you got to start. So I'm not telling you where you got to come out at the end of this conversation, but at least be engaged in the text, the scriptural texts that actually do lay down some ways to think through this. So that's kind of where I am on that.
Related to this is, where does the concept of grace fit in all of this? And, you just mentioned the Ten Commandments and the law. And while I'm not disciple, I am disciple of Christ, pastor, but I was trained by Lutherans. So law and gospel kind of just is always in my brain. And it seems like we live in an age where there's a lot of law, and it doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to be putting up the Ten Commandments somewhere, but there isn't a whole lot of necessarily of grace in our politics. And I don't know if that's something you've observed, or where does grace have a role in our modern politics?
That is a great question. And I absolutely think it has a role to play. And you see it, I think, when politicians are able to see each other as human beings and get to work together across their differences. So I think one of the things in that sort of law gospel paradigm, Luther says the law says what a thing is. So you begin with what's actually true. And so I think in politics, one of the ways you get to grace is by acknowledging what is going on. So not trying to paper over or dismiss the differences that we have, the different viewpoints we have. And I think grace often looks like a Republican trying to understand where a Democrat is coming from, a Democrat trying to understand where a Republican is coming from, even within these caucuses, whether you're maybe you're kind of a Susan Murkowski or Lisa Murkowski or Susan Collins, more centrist Republican, and you've got your more right-wing Republicans, but just trying to see like where are you coming from? Where are you on this? What are your perspectives on it? And I think so seeing the other as a real human being and trying to work together, I think there's some real grace in that. But it begins with acknowledging where you act, where you don't agree, and then trying to find areas where you can. And I think there's a lot of this happening behind the scenes. I just listened to a Republican politician on the New York Times Daily podcast who talked about going to town halls, and like a lot of his colleagues are not doing it anymore because they get booed and yelled at and all that. But he's like, no, it's really important to me that I go and hear what my constituents are saying and respond to those. I think there's a lot of grace in that. I mean, I'm not saying this guy is Jesus at all. Please don't hear me saying that. It's not a partisan endorsement or anything of his campaign, but being willing to go in front of a group of people who are just going to hurl insults at you and to hear and listen to them, and to treat them respectfully, even if they don't respect or speak respectfully to you. I think there was grace in that. There was a veteran who stood up and said, "Look, this big, beautiful bill is going to cut my benefits," and the political the politician said, "Well, let me get back to you on that." And he said they addressed it. I don't know if that happened but it was an example to me of someone showing some grace. James Talarico is a Texas legislator here. He's a Democrat, but he's in seminary. He knows his scriptures backwards and forwards. And he just famously was on Joe Rogan's podcast. And one of the things he talked about is really is building friendships, building relationships with his Republican lawmaker colleagues, and trying to work together for common sense good. So to me, that's where a lot of the grace is, on those one-on-one or small group relationships. I think grace is, and it's another word for love, and you can't have love if you don't see the other person as a human being. So there is room for grace in that, and is seeing the other person as a human being. And I think in our interpersonal relationships, in our families, where we have these disagreements over politics, I think we can be honest. That's saying what a thing is. This, I believe this, you believe that. Like we can acknowledge that, but then trying to listen to what the other person is saying, and never lose sight of the humanity of the other. And if they have some views that you find really, really obnoxious or difficult, there's probably some story in their psyche, in their origin, in their heart about why they are like that. And I think this is something that a good theological perspective can add to the political debate, which is that if you are a person who adopts what I would call the anthropology of the Bible, that is the view of human beings that is in scriptures, which is to say we are not people who are rational, make good decisions, and control our emotions. The scriptures show us as people, as Jeremiah says, the human heart is deceptive of all things. Who can understand it? And so if that's where we're starting from, the reason you get angry at somebody who disagrees with you is because you think that they have made a poor choice and you can convince them otherwise. You think it's a rational thing. And I think a theological perspective can sometimes remind you that the person you're talking to is not, there's reason there, but their political beliefs are not because they sat down with like, here's how to be a Republican and here's how to be a Democrat. They read both books, they made a decision, and they came out on their side. And so, like, that's not how it happens. It happens because, like, maybe they're a staunch Republican because their grandma was a staunch Republican and then their dad was a staunch Republican, and they feel like some sort of family loyalty. Again, it's not rational. It's like, this is my tribe, and I can't, if I give this up, I lose my social circle, I lose my family network, I lose all kinds of things. And those aren't conscious front of mind thoughts, but that's under there. So when you're having a conversation, or somebody has, on the left side of things, maybe they have they were really helped in a rough time by some social programs that they attribute to Democrats. And so, like, again, so the non-rationality of it, I think, can help you have compassion for people when you're talking, and it maybe can make you more of a listener. Like, what's the story behind this for you? Where did this come from for you? Why do you hold that belief? As opposed to, you're wrong, and I'm going to tell you why, and I'm going to convince you because we're rational beings, which we're not.
Close to being rational.
So. I mean, except for you, Dennis. You are rational, and you have a wonderful DJ voice, and I want to hear you. I'd like to make a request. Just kidding.
Well, I could do that. It's been about 30 years, but I could do that.
Okay. All right.
So you never know. So I think one of the things, kind of getting closer to the end of this, is we have a lot of people in congregations, pastors in congregations that are maybe purple congregations, maybe they're more or different shades of blue or red. What advice would you give to them in preaching, and how you're not going to make every sermon about whatever the political issue is of the day. But how do you convey the sense of God's love and grace, especially in talking about politics, in having people when they discuss or politics in their daily life?
One, I think in my tradition, but I think there's plenty of flexibility in other traditions to do this. I think the liturgy, the service order, can do some of that work for you. We have this time called the Prayers of the People. We follow a Book of Common Prayer. One of the gifts of that tradition is that it has us pray in the form that we use Sunday after Sunday, has us pray by name for elected representatives, so that we pray for the president, the governor, and the mayor, and the Congress and the courts. But we name our President Joe, our Governor Greg, and our Mayor Jim. And we used to pray for our President Joe, our Governor Greg, and before that we prayed for our President Donald, and before that so we've prayed for everybody by their first names. And I think so there's and people have told me time and again over the years how much they appreciate that, and how it's a spirit, like whether they're on the left or the right, at some point about every 4 years they're praying for somebody that they like, but then they're going to be praying for somebody they don't like, and there's a teaching that comes from that. But in terms of preaching, I think realize that for the most part, and this changes in context and culture and geography, and I get that, but I think for the most part, people that are coming to church on Sundays are not looking for a political sermon. Mm-hmm. Most people are looking for something that will give them some comfort in the face of the diagnosis they just received, their marriage that's falling apart, their estranged adult child that just reached out and they don't know how to respond, or just their own inner sense of, gosh, the secret lives of people that we have, and wanting a word of comfort in that place and forgiveness. So most people come looking for that. They're not looking for a sermon to tell them how to necessarily interpret the headlines. So I think that's one thing I would say. The other thing I would like, gosh, can you imagine if somebody just had a child diagnosed with a glioblastoma and they come to church and they hear a sermon about Middle Eastern politics? Like, as important that is, but like they need a word of comfort. And so I'd say stick to the scriptures. What do they say? And how do they give a word of grace and hope and comfort and forgiveness to the actual individual human being, not the collective, but to the individual? And the key for preachers is to first know that need for themselves. So if you're a preacher, what speaks to you about this passage? You can approach the text as something. How is this going to give me ammunition to then convince my congregation to agree with me politically? That's one way you can approach it, and I think that will probably not be as effective. And I think the other thing would be instead, though, to look at it as, what does this say to me as a human being, and am I in touch with that, my own brokenness, and then how can I convey that to the congregation? Again, I think politically driven sermons. And as you can see in my sermon from 2022, I talked about anger, but I didn't say it's like bad that people out there are angry. I said we're angry. I'm angry. And so what does this passage say to us? It invites us all to kind of a place of acknowledging that reality and receiving grace for that. And as I said, when James and John, if they had called down fire from heaven on the Samaritan village, it would have blown them up too, because they were standing right next to it. So it's the invitation is to look at yourself, look at your inner workings. But so stay rooted in the text, stay personal and connected, know what it says to you, and try to speak to that place, knowing that political sermons tend not to persuade. I would you should do a poll with your listeners. How many of them went into church one Sunday with some firmly held political or cultural belief, heard a preacher say the opposite from the pulpit, and then changed their mind?
Oh, that would be no one.
Yeah, nobody ever does. Yeah, because somebody says, you should vote this way or think this way. Like, if you disagree with that, you're gonna dig in your heels more. You get defensive and like, how dare you? And you're never gonna go back to the church. So, I think for preachers, I would say, take care of yourself. See how the message of grace and the gospel connects to you, and try to deliver that to the congregation. The one thing I would say is there are times when the political events of the wider culture become pastoral.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember after the loss of Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump in 2016, that Sunday, because of what I knew about my purple congregation, I knew that there were some people that would be really sad and just really kind of despondent, and I knew there'd be some other people that would be kind of gleefully surprised. And I felt the emotions around that were so high. I felt like to not address it was to not address actually personal pastoral issues. So, like, sometimes when the political becomes personal and pastoral, I think that's a place you can address it, but not necessarily to say, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, but and I remember what I said, I think in that sermon was, whatever you do as Christians, now the rest of the world, that's another thing, but as Christians, we're not allowed to dehumanize people, and the gospel is for everybody. So I think those are some of my thoughts on preaching for pastors. But now that I've just told them what to do, they're probably not going to do it. So I don't know.
You never know. I think these days, with a lot of what we're getting, they may want to hear it. I need to hear that.
Well, I'll say one of the things that's interesting about grace, like, a lot of people come to St. Albans, and I hear this from a lot of my clergy friends who are self-consciously choosing not to preach partisan political sermons. Lots of people from the left and the right have come to St. Albans and said that one of the things we really appreciate about this place is that you stick to the scriptures and you make it connecting and personal and real to us, and you don't bring politics into the pulpit, is how they phrase it. But what's interesting is, because of that reality, there are people in the pews and at the potluck suppers and at the communion rail who have wildly different perspectives on all the culture war topics and then what party they vote for. And what's amazing over the years has been to see the relationships and the friendships that have grown out of that, and serving together and ministering together. And I have seen people change their minds, but it's not because somebody got up in the pulpit and told them to do so. It's because of the relationships they developed, and they felt loved and respected. So they didn't change because they felt they were being pressured to. They adjusted or softened their views out of a loving relationship with their fellow human being, whom God loved and for whom God died. So I think that's another place where the grace can come in.
Yeah, I think I interviewed someone a few years ago, actually about a year and a half ago, Presbyterian pastor, that said I asked him what he was going to preach the Sunday after the election. And one of the things that he brought up was that if there was someone in his community, and his church is a purple church, who was going through a divorce, the last thing that they want to hear is a sermon about who won
Right.
that election. And I think that that has stuck with me, especially stuck with me in how I was going to preach the Sunday after the election, and from then onward. Um,
Yeah.
because you don't know who walks into those doors. And in some ways, as a pastor, that isn't your role. Your role is really to preach the love and grace of God.
Hmm.
There are times that you may need to talk a little bit more clearly about certain issues, but not all the time, and probably not
Yeah,
most of
and
the time.
I think that's right. I think the other thing, we have, like I mentioned, this Bible study that I teach on Wednesdays during the academic year. We have small groups that meet in homes. We have Sunday school, our adult formation classes, and those are places where if you're going to have conversations about political or cultural, theological issues where there can be some heat because there can be some controversy, I'm more comfortable having it in those areas. The pulpit, it's not.
Hmm.
I mean, there is two-way conversation. There's nonverbal from the congregation, but it is. I mean, there's a reason they call it a bully pulpit, because if you
Yep.
use it, you're being a bully because they don't have the opportunity to respond, and you don't really have the opportunity to listen to them. But if it's a Sunday school class, and I can say, "Hey, we're going to talk about immigration from a Christian perspective. What do the scriptures say about this?" And you can, give a 20-minute overview, and then you can say, let's have questions, or let's break down into small groups at our tables, and you got some questions there, let's talk about it, and then there can be back and forth, there can be listening, and I think those spaces are more conducive to those kinds of conversations, and we do try to build those into our life here. And I think those can be helpful. But yeah, I think you're right. Think about the person going through divorce, thinking about the person who just lost a child, thinking about the person who just lost a job, thinking about the person who just, whatever they have going on, like speak to that, speak to the heart. And those big issues outside are, I think ultimately they fade away. Our citizenship is in heaven. I think that conversation between Pilate and Jesus is really, I think Christians could spend some time there about where real power is and where our citizenship is, and what does Jesus' kingship, his lordship, really mean.
Hmm. Well, if people want to know more and follow you, where should they go online?
They can go to, so all of my preaching and for the whole congregation is at St. Albans Waco, STALBANSWACO, St. Albans Waco, on all the places for the socials. And I'm still on, I guess I have to say X now, Zimmermania there. And I have a weekly preaching podcast with Jacob Smith, a priest in New York, who's also a previous and less effective podcast guest for you, Dennis, I would probably say. And so that's called Same Old Song, and you can find that wherever you get your podcasts.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Aaron, for taking the time. This, I think, was helpful, and I hope it's been helpful for pastors out there as they're trying to figure out what to do and how to best preach. And I think
Thanks, Dennis.
it's been good. So,
Yeah,
all
well,
right.
I appreciate it, and grateful for you taking time out of your pastoral role to provide this resource for lots of people. So thank you.
All right. So let me know your thoughts about the conversation. Um, I hope that that was helpful for you, especially if you are the pastor of a purple congregation or some lighter shade of blue or red. Uh, Love to know your thoughts. As always, please send them in. You can send me an email at churchandmain, all one word, at substack.com. I do have links to Jacob Smith's episode from earlier this year, links to Aaron and Jacob's podcast, Same Old Song, which I do listen to on a weekly basis since I preach from the Revised Common Lectionary. It's a great podcast. I love it. And the banter between the two is great. So, but it's just a great podcast, especially just if you're someone that follows the Revised Common Lectionary. So those two links are available. And I also have the link to Aaron's 2022 sermon, and I hope that you will listen to it. It's an important one, and I think it is actually still vital today, even though time has passed. I think actually we need it now more than ever. So please give it a listen. If you want to learn more about this podcast, listen to past episodes, or donate, visit churchinmaine.org. You can also visit churchinmaine.substack.com to read related articles. Subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. That helps others find this podcast. Also, if you want to, you can sign up to get the podcast in your email inbox. There are links in the show notes. You can also leave a donation. There are links for that also in the show notes. That is it for this episode of Church in Maine. As I always say, thank you so much for listening. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care, everyone. Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.